This is the story of a tiny crown, a glittering stage, and a house wrapped in Christmas warmth, hiding a secret that would freeze an entire country in its tracks. This is the story of a child who dazzled the world, and a mystery that still whispers through the cold halls of Boulder, Colorado. On that winter night, the Ramsey home looked like every picture-perfect American postcard. Snow dusting the rooftops, golden lights glowing from the windows, a family asleep after a long holiday evening. But behind those warm walls, something unthinkable was unfolding. Something that would shatter a family, divide a nation, and send investigators spiraling into a maze that felt designed to keep the truth buried forever. JonBenét Ramsey, 6 years old, beauty pageant star, loved, adored, photographed, celebrated. A child who moved through rooms like a burst of light. A child whose presence felt too big for her tiny frame. And yet, by the next morning, her name would no longer represent crowns or applause, but the darkest, unanswered question in American crime. Inside the house, everything looked normal. Too normal. A Christmas tree still glowing, presents still half-opened, decorations untouched. But somewhere between the sparkle and silence, something had gone horribly wrong. When her mother discovered that strange ransom letter, 3 pages long, handwritten, dramatic in a way ransom notes never were. It didn't just ignite panic, it ignited confusion. It read like a performance, like someone trying too hard to sound dangerous, too hard to sound foreign, too hard to sound real. The house filled with tension as the note echoed in the mother's hands. The demand was oddly specific, disturbingly calculated. The number chosen felt personal, not random. And yet the note promised a kidnapping, while the child it claimed to hide was still somewhere inside the very house. People say the air inside a crime scene changes. It thickens, as if it remembers what happened even when the humans inside don't. And that Ramsey home, silent, polished, massive, suddenly felt like it was breathing cold secrets. Every room felt off, every shadow felt heavier than it should, and no one realized that the truth was lying just 1 floor below them. Down in the basement, the air was different, still, heavy, undisturbed. A part of the house that rarely saw laughter or footsteps. And in that silent, forgotten space, the story shifted from a kidnapping mystery to something far more chilling. A discovery that would ripple across the world in minutes. A realization that the nightmare had never stepped outside that house at all. When her father walked down those steps, calling her name, the atmosphere didn't answer him back. The basement held its breath as if waiting for him to see what it had been forced to witness. And then, hidden in a corner, wrapped in a white blanket like someone trying to imitate gentleness, he found her, still, small, lifeless. The scream that followed didn't just echo through the basement, it echoed through the entire nation. From that moment on, nothing made sense. Not the injuries, not the staging, not the fake note, not the strange details scattered around the house like pieces of a puzzle designed to never fit together. Investigators walked through hallways that felt too clean, too organized, too touched, as if the scene had been handled long before the police ever entered. Whispers began. Whispers that would grow into storms. Whispers about who was in the house, who had access, who knew her routine. Who could have created a story so twisted and yet so fragile that it fell apart under the slightest pressure? The case was unfolding not like a typical investigation, but like a psychological maze, every turn leading deeper, every clue raising more questions than answers. Her parents stood at the center of a storm they couldn't escape. Cameras outside their home, reporters dissecting their expressions, their words, their movements. Every detail became evidence. Every tear became suspicious. Every moment of grief became an argument. People forgot they were human. People forgot that grief can look 1,000 different ways. especially when tangled with shock, fear, and the crushing weight of being blamed by an entire nation. Inside police rooms across Boulder, investigators sat staring at photos and reports that refused to align. There were signs of a struggle, yet also signs of staging. There were markings that suggested planned actions, yet also moments that felt panicked and impulsive. It was like two stories overlapping, fighting to dominate the narrative. A crime done with intention, but also with chaos. A crime done by someone who knew the house intimately, yet tried desperately to pretend they were an outsider. The ransom note itself became its own monster. Too long, too theatrical, too conveniently placed, and written in a voice that didn't match any known criminal patterns. It was a letter that read like someone trying to imitate a movie villain rather than an actual kidnapper. Experts tore it apart line by line, searching for hidden meanings, mistakes, patterns. And yet, even the handwriting analysis only deepened the fog. Nothing was clear. Everything was possible. And in the center of all this was JonBenét, a child whose bright smile became a symbol of innocence lost. A child plastered on news screens, magazine covers, and the collective consciousness of millions. A child whose story refused to fade because it didn't feel like just another tragedy. It felt like a mirror held up to America's darkest fears. Fear of violence inside the home, fear of secrets behind perfect facades, fear of the unknown hiding in familiar places. Police, experts, neighbors, friends. Everyone had theories. Everyone had suspicions. The house became a character of its own in the narrative. A place that seemed to hold answers yet refused to reveal them. And the more investigators searched, the more the questions multiplied. Why that basement room? Why those injuries? Why the bizarre note? Why the strange behaviors before and after? Why did everything feel both deliberate and desperate? The case grew into a national obsession. Talk shows debated it. Experts argued over it. People across the country dissected every detail as if solving it would somehow mend the wound it left behind. But with every passing day, the mystery deepened. Evidence became contaminated, leads dissolved, witnesses contradicted themselves, and the truth began sinking into a darkness that felt nearly impossible to recover from. As the storm grew louder, the line between fact and speculation blurred beyond recognition. Rumors became headlines, theories became public judgment, and somewhere within that chaos, the real story, the true, raw, unfiltered story of what happened that night, became buried under layers of noise. Yet the mystery refused to die, because deep down everyone sensed something. Crimes done in rage looked like storms. Crimes done in cold calculation looked like chess. But this looked like both. Something emotional had erupted, and then someone tried desperately to bury it beneath a performance. Someone tried to rewrite the truth. Someone tried to craft a narrative so dramatic that people would get lost in the theatrics instead of seeing the simplicity beneath. But the truth has a strange way of lingering. It clings to the walls. It hides in the corners of rooms. It waits in the silence. And in that Boulder home, even decades later, the truth feels like it's still there, unspoken, unresolved, watching every theory that rises and falls. This case is more than a mystery. It's a haunting. A story that pulls you back again and again, whispering that you've missed something, that the real answer is right there, just out of reach. And the deeper you go, the colder it gets. Because this isn't just the story of a child lost. It's the story of a secret that never sleeps. The thing about a case like this is that it doesn't stay inside the walls where it happened. It escapes. It seeps into living rooms across the country, through television screens, through late-night conversations, through the quiet moments when people swear they've stopped thinking about it, only to realize it's still sitting in the back of their mind, like a ghost refusing to leave. The investigators working the case felt that same haunting weight. Every time they believed they were getting close, the path twisted. Every time they believed something made sense, another detail shattered it. The truth seemed to hide behind mirrors, reflecting possibilities but never revealing itself fully. And nothing complicated the hunt more than the fact that the crime didn't look like it came from outside. It looked like it grew from inside. Inside the house, inside the walls, inside the family's private world. The basement became the symbolic heart of the mystery, a cold, silent chamber where the final moments of a child's life had played out. Investigators stood in that room, letting their eyes trace every angle. They tried to imagine footsteps, movements, a timeline that made sense. But the surfaces told a fragmented story. There were hints of calm, hints of panic, hints of someone who didn't expect to be caught. It was a scene that felt rehearsed and rushed at the same time, as if someone had tried desperately to create a version of events that could pull attention away from the truth. And then there was the house itself, large, elegant, filled with rooms that felt too untouched. Investigators described it as a place that almost swallowed sound, a place where anything could happen and no one would hear a thing. That became one of the most chilling elements of the story, the possibility that everything unfolded while the rest of the home slept under soft Christmas lights. As the media frenzy exploded, people across the nation became self-appointed detectives. They scrutinized the handwriting, the layout of the home, the statements made by the family. They argued over the tone of the ransom note, the inconsistencies in reactions, the strange gaps in the story. The case became a kind of twisted collective puzzle, one that drew in millions of minds, each convinced they had a piece of the answer. But all those pieces never formed a complete picture. Every conclusion left something missing, something impossible to explain away. For investigators, the biggest challenge wasn't the lack of evidence. It was the abundance of contradictions. Every clue came with a shadow. Every piece of evidence came with a question mark. Every path split into two, and neither direction led to certainty. It was like the crime itself had been stitched together from conflicting intentions, part fear, part anger, part planning, part desperation. The ransom note loomed over everything. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a performance. A message written by someone trying to mimic a criminal archetype they had only seen in movies. The phrasing sounded dramatic, the threats over-exaggerated, the tone strangely conversational. Experts could read the entire note and feel the presence of someone who wanted to sound dangerous, but didn't know how real criminals actually spoke. And that made the note less of a clue, and more of a confession that the writer had no idea how to hide their own style. Investigators began analyzing every word, every curve, every hesitation in the handwriting. They compared it to known samples. They studied the pressure of the pen, the spacing of the letters. But the unsettling part was this. Even when the handwriting pointed somewhere, the logic of the crime pointed somewhere else. It was a case that seemed to fight against its own solution. As days passed, America watched the parents closely, too closely. Their grief became public property. Every facial expression, every sentence, every gesture became evidence in the court of public opinion. Some people looked at them and saw sorrow. Others looked and saw guilt. And the harsh truth was that no one outside that house would ever know what those private moments really looked like. No one would know what panic does to a person when the unthinkable has happened. No one would understand how a family behaves when they become the center of a nightmare they can't wake from. The father's discovery of the body also raised questions that never quieted down. Why that room? Why that blanket? Why those bindings? Why the strange combination of actions that suggested someone trying to disguise the true motive behind the crime? Investigators were caught between two possibilities. Someone inside the house had crafted a staging. or someone outside the house had executed the most confusing, contradictory crime imaginable. Neither option made complete sense. Both options made terrible sense. The deeper experts dug into the case, the more they realized that the truth wasn't going to reveal itself easily. This crime wasn't sloppy, but it also wasn't perfect. It sat in that chilling space between intelligence and panic, the kind of crime where the person responsible was close, familiar, emotional, but trying to pretend it was the work of a stranger. And that duality became the most haunting part of the investigation. The community of Boulder, once quiet and peaceful, turned into a place filled with suspicion. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Reporters stood on sidewalks night after night, waiting for any movement. Police cars patrolled streets that had never seen violence like this before. And in the midst of all that tension, the Ramsey house stood like a monument to unanswered questions. Inside police stations, detectives argued over theories. Some believed it was a family member. Some believed an intruder had slipped in unseen. Some believed the clues were intentionally misleading. Arguments grew heated. Careers were defined and destroyed by this case. It became the kind of investigation that consumed people's lives. Once you entered the world of the Ramsey mystery, you didn't walk out unchanged. You didn't forget the details. They clung to your mind long after you closed the files. And yet, despite all the chaos, one core truth remained. The victim was a child who barely understood fear, a child whose biggest worry should have been which dress to wear for her next performance, a child who deserved a simple, safe life, but was instead pulled into a tragedy that still clings to America decades later. Experts began studying the psychological patterns behind the crime. They asked themselves what type of person would write such a note, what type of person would use such elaborate staging, what type of person would commit an act so intimate and then try to disguise it with theatrics. The case didn't resemble a typical kidnapping. It didn't resemble a break-in. It resembled someone trying to bury a personal mistake under a mountain of misdirection. Even the smallest details felt suspiciously intentional. The placement of objects, the condition of the body, the choices made during the staging. It was as if the crime was performed for an audience that wasn't there yet, an audience that would eventually include the entire nation. And that unsettling sense of performance made investigators question whether the crime was spontaneous or premeditated in a moment of overwhelming emotion. There were nights when detectives sat alone at their desks, staring at the files, feeling the weight of the silence inside those pages. They described the case like a living thing, one that grew darker the more you studied it. Some said the house felt cursed, others said the story felt cursed. But everyone agreed on one thing. The truth was hiding behind something deceptively simple. The public continued to obsess. Talk shows dissected every angle, books were written, documentaries produced, experts interviewed over and over. Yet the most haunting part was this. With every explanation came a contradiction. With every theory came a flaw. The crime refused to settle into a single narrative. It refused to become clear. It was like standing in a fog where shadows kept shifting. Every time you thought you recognized a figure, it dissolved into something else. Every time you reached for a conclusion, it slipped through your fingers. And the fog never lifted. The case became an open wound in American crime history. A constant reminder that some stories are not meant to be neatly solved. Some stories are meant to challenge everything we think we know about human behavior, about violence, about the masks people wear. People often say that truth leaves footprints, but in this case the footprints were rearranged, overlapped, swept aside, and rewritten until no one could tell which direction they originally pointed. The staging blurred the lines, the note blurred the lines, the contradictory evidence blurred the lines, and soon the world realized that they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for clarity in a story built out of confusion. Yet even through the confusion, one presence stayed sharp and unforgettable. JonBenét. Her image became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of innocence drowned in a sea of shadows. A reminder that behind all the drama, analysis, and noise, a little girl's life had been stolen in the most unimaginable way. And that is why the case still lingers. That is why it refuses to die. Because somewhere in that basement, in that house full of secrets, in that night wrapped in Christmas silence, the truth still lives, unspoken, waiting, heavy like a locked door no one has managed to open. A crime like this doesn't fade. It echoes, it stains, it becomes part of the culture, part of the conversations, part of the nightmares people whisper about when the room goes dark. And as long as the truth stays hidden, the story keeps breathing. In the months that followed, the case transformed into something larger than the crime itself. It became a mirror, reflecting the fears, the doubts, the fractures inside an entire nation. People weren't just searching for a killer. They were searching for meaning in a story that felt designed to defy understanding. Investigators revisited every detail again and again, hoping repetition might reveal something they'd missed. But every room in that house still whispered the same contradiction. The crime looked intimate, yet covered in theatrics, emotional, yet wrapped in calculation. Someone had reached into the darkest corner of human impulse and then tried to dress it in a costume of a stranger's crime. And that's what kept everyone awake at night. The idea that the truth wasn't far away. The idea that the truth was close. Too close. Over time, theories hardened into beliefs. Beliefs hardened into arguments. And arguments hardened into a kind of national stalemate. No matter which side people stood on, they were sure the other side was blind. And in that endless tug-of-war, the real story slipped deeper into the shadows. The Ramsey home was eventually sold. The lights went out. The Christmas glow faded from its windows. But the air around it never felt clean again. Even long after the family left, locals avoided walking past it at night. They said the house felt heavy, like it still carried the residue of a secret it refused to share, like the walls themselves remembered what happened more clearly than anyone ever would. And then there was the basement, that cold room, that final doorway into a mystery that never opened all the way. Some investigators said they still saw it in their dreams, how quiet it was, how still, how unnaturally undisturbed. A room that held a tragedy yet offered no explanation. A room that felt like a sentence with the last word missing. But the truth is this: some crimes are puzzles you solve, others are wounds you carry, and this one became both. As years passed, new experts arrived, old experts revisited the evidence, documentaries resurfaced the questions, journalists reopened the files. The case kept rising back into the public consciousness like a wave that refused to settle. Every time people thought they had reached the final theory, another possibility emerged. Every time the story seemed to quiet down, another detail reignited the storm. But through all of it, one thing never changed. The story always returned to the same gravity point: a young girl whose life was stolen in the silence of her own home. JonBenét became more than a name, more than a photograph, more than a headline. She became a reminder that behind every unsolved mystery is a human heart that never got to finish its story. A reminder that evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it grows in the hidden corners of places we trust the most. A reminder that even in the brightest houses, shadows can find their way in. And that is why this case still haunts the world. Not because of the clues, not because of the theories, not because of the endless speculation, but because deep down everyone senses the same thing. The truth is out there, close, silent, breathing just beneath the surface, a truth that was never lost, just never spoken. And until the day it rises, the JonBenét Ramsey case will remain exactly what it has always been. A story wrapped in innocence, buried in darkness, and frozen in a moment the world has never been able to escape. The mystery didn't end that night. It began.